I tasted copper again when the gate irised open and exhaled cold, sanctified air across my face. The lumen archers recognized the new ident seal under my skin and sang a chord too pure to be anything but mechanical devotion. A pair of robed servitors bowed as if their spines were hinges and not bones. Behind them, a custodian's shadow stretched like the wing of a titan across the marble. I had once believed the elite lived above pain and dust and ration chalk, but the first truth that greeted me past the threshold was the smell of disinfectant, sharper than a reprimand. They stripped my hab clothes with the exactitude of archivists removing an outdated page. A functionary with a mouth like a thin wound recited clauses about property and personhood, and I signed the transfer with a stylus that drew blood as ink. The stylus drank my name and gave me a different one back, smaller, harder, suitable for records that prefer nouns to people. An attendant placed garments over my shoulders that felt less like clothes and more like a sentence carried out with admirable efficiency. Slate black coat. Soft collar that hid a whisper priest bead. Signet cog that twitch-stung my palm every time my heart misstepped. The custodian did not speak, because his kind are a language, and I had not yet been taught to read it. My escort, lesser by every measure and thus permitted words, inclined his head the width of a nail. "You will not look at the throne," he said. "You will not say his name loudly. You will say it correctly." We walked. The floor taught me humility. Some stones were warm, some cold, and the pattern made no sense until I noticed the heat traced a path toward altars, and the cold led away, as if even conduction obeyed liturgy. The halls changed from municipal glory to liturgical intent, each vault heavier with history than the last. Marble ceded to something older than marble, veined with fossils like the notion of time petrified. I tried to keep my gaze ahead, but the walls were crowded with victories that refused to be background. Saints bent over worlds like gardeners pruning generations. Angels with helmets held spears wrapped in prayer scrolls, faded to the color of old teeth. Between frescoes, 1,000 bronze skulls watched, their eye sockets fitted with lenses that dilated politely as I passed. The air tasted of incense cut with ozone, like a cathedral welded to a reactor. The administrative escort did not slow when robed figures knelt in an alcove and pressed augmetic foreheads to the floor, plates clinking like a pocket full of coins. "Do not stop unless compelled," he said. "Compulsion is clearly labeled in the palace." I wondered what label compels a man to kneel so hard he wears the stone smooth. We passed a threshold where gravity felt corrected rather than natural. A hum resolved into 2 notes, then 10, then a braided tone that arranged my heartbeat without permission. "The choir," the escort said, as if naming the ocean. "They are practicing for accuracy. A choir that measures itself in lives rather than bars sings differently, and I realized the ache in my molars was not fear, but resonance." He led me to a chamber whose ceiling was a map of constellations, dead for millennia and nonetheless useful. A notary with fingers stained the color of secrets dipped a quill in black that shone like a night too clear to be kind. "Affirm your loyalty," she said. Her voice was dry, paper rubbing itself into ash. I spoke the words and felt them press into shape around me, like hot metal into a mold. A picture took my likeness and erased it into a better version, narrower in the eyes, sharper in the chin, as if truth had to obey the geometry of obedience. They recorded my gait, my breath cadence, the angle at which my shoulders apologized to doors. A medici choir filed past me in silence and took measurements the way rain takes roofs. One slipped a needle behind my ear and whispered a benediction to the god of sterility. Another pressed a wafer to my tongue that dissolved into a taste like old pennies and new rules. A third fitted the signet cog more deeply into my palm until the prick was not pain, but punctuation. "Proximity is privilege," the administrator said. "Proximity is peril. Learn which is which by the week's end." He gave me a slate that contained no writing and somehow weighed more than stone. He explained nothing about the slate because explanation is a resource, and I had not earned more than weight. A servitor with a face half scraped of expression guided me to a balcony that overlooked a courtyard where trees attempted to remember forests. Leaves shook in a wind curated by officials whose titles were written in the long grammar of pedigree. Throne sparrows hopped along the balustrade, too symbolic to fly with grace. I reached toward one and stopped when it turned both heads, because everything here had more heads than comfort recommends. In the distance I saw arches that made mockery of gravity, their keystones inscribed with names longer than most lives. In the near distance, I saw myself reflected in a panel of glass meant to discourage assassins by reflecting everyone into something guilty. I looked appropriate. Appropriate is a color you bleed into slowly. My guide taught me to stand 2 steps behind and half a step to the left, where important men want their conscience to appear. He showed me how to incline my head at the sight of certain sigils, and how long to wait between a question and the obedience that follows. He explained that silence is a robe tailored to each occasion, and mine would arrive once I stopped speaking to fill fear. We crossed a cloister where novices scrubbed guilt from the grooves of a mural and replaced it with fresher guilt, because history oxidizes if unattended. A confessor waited in the shade and watched me approach with the professional curiosity of a butcher meeting a new cut. He unrolled a crimson cloth on the ledge and placed 4 objects upon it with the tenderness of arranging bones. A quill, a coin, a key, a knife. His eyes were patient and unkind. "Touch one," he said. "Be seen as that choice until you are seen no more." My hand drifted between key and knife like a moth undecided about which flame is home. I took the knife. It was heavier than honesty and cooler than intent. The confessor nodded, as if counting a result that rarely changes. "Then learn to cut cleanly," he said. They brought tea that smelled of cardamom and cautions. I held the cup correctly because I watched the servitor watch my fingers. The porcelain was thin enough to carry sound, and the sound it carried was the faint thrum beneath the palace's 1,000 voices. If you listen long enough, you can tell when the power is diverted to the Astronomicon, because the humming stops pretending to be walls and becomes a statement. I imagined the light burning across the black, and the choir feeding it names and hours and hopes, and my own breath tried to become part of the offering without asking me first. We proceeded along a corridor where the floor mosaics depicted victories so old the tesserae had worn smooth under generations of triumph. Between the saints and engines stood niches containing reliquaries, each labeled with a syllable of a saint's true name. A small servo bell rung once, and my escort stopped. I stopped because stopping was the correct prayer to a bell you do not own. A procession flowed past like a wound that had learned choreography. Tech priests with faces lacquered in red lacquer and faith. Scribes whose hands moved like spiders writing webs over blank air. A single empty palanquin carried by men who looked straight ahead with the discipline of those who do not survive side-eye. No one explained the absence upon the palanquin. The absence explained itself. A boy in novice grey swept a line of dust from the base of a statue and exposed a word carved there that had been rubbed nearly smooth by the love of boots. The word was duty. The word was smaller than the foot that covered it. My guide escorted me through a door that thought it was a throat. It closed behind us with the soft certainty of digestion. Inside, a clerk recited my particulars without looking up, his voice the click of beads in a counting frame measuring the years I owed. He fitted a vox thread into my ear and made the sign of the aquila without bothering his eyes to agree with his hands. He told me what to call myself and how to answer when others called me worse. He told me to forget my previous address because the palace has no streets, only permissions. He told me to eat when commanded and otherwise let hunger be a devotional. I nodded like a man nods when the ocean informs him of salt. A seamstress took my measurements and pinned cloth that had already chosen my outline. The garments smelled faintly of old cedar and recent funerals. She marked 3 places where seams would allow for breadth in case my duties required a body shaped for notice. She marked 1 place where the seam would never yield. I asked nothing because questions are a currency better spent after you learn which faces give change. The day stretched like wire drawn through too many mills. I learned the route to the morning brief, which included a stair you should never ascend on your left foot first. I learned the antechamber cushions were rationed in comfort against favor, and sitting on the wrong one made an argument you did not have time to win. I learned that the servo skulls hovering shoulder high were calibrated to my pulse, and that a certain rapidity would open a door in the wall for a medici who preferred to be invisible until necessity summoned his discipline. The invisible medici watched me once through the wall and then closed it as if laying a document flat to avoid creasing. When food arrived, it came with names, not numbers. Grock's marrow folded into bread that remembered being grain under an alien sun. Wine the color of old bruises that tasted of promises made by families who hold ships instead of lands. I ate slowly because appetite is a confession in front of people who are trained to prosecute it. Luxury is a ledger you swallow. By evening they granted me a bed that was not a slab and a room whose window looked upon a courtyard that changed its statues to match victories I had not yet earned the right to know. The linen was softer than memory. I lay down like a man being archived. Sleep did not find me because the palace hum is a living thing and demanded audience. At first I thought it was in the walls, then I thought it was in the floor. Then I learned it was in me, as if the building had set a tuning fork against my ribs and declared me adequate. From somewhere below, the deeper below, the hush of titanic relays rolling into place carried up the stairs of air and settled on my chest like a cat that weighs a cathedral. If I breathed with it, the pressure eased. If I breathed against it, my teeth ached. I listened long enough to tell when power shifted toward the heart of things, and when it drew back like a tide, ashamed of what it left on the sand. I counted imperfections in the ceiling paneling out of an old habit that kept my mind from climbing cliffs it could not descend. 63 dents, 12 rust blooms shaped like small continents that will never be charted. One panel misaligned by the thickness of a lie. I rose and walked the edges of my new world and pressed my palm to the seam where the wall whispered to the door about loyalty. The signet cog pricked twice and released a notch of warmth that felt like approval doled out by a machine unwilling to waste it. A message flowered on the slate without arriving. Report to Orientation 3 at second bell. Attire. Silence. Compliance. The words arranged themselves on my tongue and waited there like a sacrament that desired a mouth. I rehearsed standing in a mirror that returned a stranger whose posture apologized less than mine used to. I practiced 3 angles of a nod, because the wrong slope of the neck could start a war you would then have to end by becoming smaller. I practiced the corrected pronunciation of his name in a whisper so thin even the skulls could not pretend to hear. In the artificial dawn, the corridor outside my door accepted me with a sigh that could have been steam or relief. Footsteps patterned the runner with a rhythm I recognized from factory floors, except now the beat belonged to a different machine. A novice at the end of the hall held a tray of small knives wrapped in linen and smiled the smile of someone who does not yet know how many uses a knife has. He asked me if I preferred a handle of bone or jet. I told him bone, because it remembers. He bowed as if I had chosen wisely and not merely chosen. The bell sounded like a measured fall of coins into a deep coffer, and the doors along the corridor opened in polite sequence, and the people who had been summoned emerged in garments that made them look like their futures had already occurred. I stepped into line with them and felt the building tilt very slightly toward a direction only it understood. The procession moved, and I moved with it, and the warmth under my skin traced a path that curved toward a door inscribed with a language I had no business comprehending, and the hum below tuned itself half a note higher, and the copper taste returned as if to remind me which mouth the words would be using. Instruction arrived disguised as courtesy, and wrapped in silk that scratched like a warning when it moved against the skin. The herald who trained me had a smile calibrated to reassure without promising anything that could be recalled later. He taught me the weight of an eye blink and the price of a pause. 3 counts of breath meant deference. 2 meant agreement. 1 meant the conversation should be recorded and burned in equal parts. He placed a metronome on the table and made me speak to its ticking until my syllables marched with parade ground precision. Words in the palace are infantry and artillery and supply chain in a single column. He showed me how to bow to sigils instead of men, because men die and sigils keep books. I learned that the correct angle of a head can forgive a small treason if it is followed by the correct silence. He corrected the way my hands rested when idle, because idle hands compose messages. Thumbs visible implied candor. Thumbs hidden implied retention. 1 thumb visible meant a gift that could not be returned politely. He said candor is a luxury, and retention is a profession. I nodded and hid both thumbs. The astropath who drilled my mind wore scars like constellations arranged by a cartographer who had run out of mercy halfway through the sky. She spoke softly, so that everything she said would need to be remembered carefully. She told me that thoughts have edges and that those edges cut through unintended listeners. She made me fold my ideas into smaller shapes until they nested like reliquaries. I learned to wrap memory in prayer so the warp would taste incense first. She placed a black coin on my tongue and had me recite the litany of blank pages until the coin felt ordinary. It never did. She said the elite do not possess stronger minds. They possess tidier ones. She watched my pupils while I told a harmless lie to an empty room and shook her head when the lie rang like a bell across a distance I could not measure. She showed me how to lie without ringing by using truths misplaced by a fraction of a heartbeat. She called it alignment. I called it survival that refused to admit its own name. The etiquette tutor dressed like an exclamation and moved like a comma. She marched me through dinners without food and conversations without meaning, so I would be ready for the opposite. She placed 12 forks before me and told me each one threatened a different faction if I touched it second. She explained how the curve of a knife points not toward the plate, but toward a patronage line older than my grandparents. I learned to lift crystal without chiming against the rim, because that chime signals hunger to ears trained to hear vulnerability as an invitation. She taught me laughter in 3 registers. The lowest says memory. The middle says allegiance. The highest says knife. I practiced them until the air in my throat understood politics. A confessor returned with his crimson cloth and the 4 objects already known to my hand. He asked if the knife felt different now that I had learned to cut with syllables. It did. It felt lighter. He nodded as if something in his ledger had balanced itself. He placed the quill in my other hand and told me to sign a name that was not mine. I did, and hated how easily the letter shapes found my fingers. He whispered that sin is a measurement problem long before it becomes a moral one. A master of household ritual taught me doors. He said every door in the palace has a mood. He said my knock must harmonize with that mood, or I would be corrected by someone who enjoys corrections. 2 knuckles for urgency, 1 knuckle for loyalty, a fingertip for grief, a fist only when carrying grace or violence, and only one of those is welcomed. He showed me thresholds that are not to be crossed with the left foot unless I wanted to meet a lawyer disguised as a saint. He showed me the runner that bleeds red under certain light to remind visitors where they stand in the order of spills. In a quiet armory of perfumes, a woman with white hair and a nose like a surgeon introduced me to the language of air. Basil for contrition, cedar for continuity. Orange blossom for new money pretending to be old. My wrists were dabbed with accords that sentenced me to intentions I had not yet agreed to. She said the elite announce themselves before they appear by letting a room inhale their thesis. She said fragrance is handwriting for people who know better than to write. A discreet surgeon with hands like lullabies taught me pain. He did not cause it, except in the small ways that inform rather than punish. He taught me how to hide it in shoulder blades and release it in calves when the corridor allows. He taught me to breathe through a stitch without needing to touch it. He taught me to stand from a chair as if gravity had asked permission. He adjusted the bead behind my ear to sit against a nerve that recorded my steadiness and reported it to a ledger that does not forgive. He said the bead is a kindness. I said the bead is a covenant I did not negotiate. He agreed and called it civilization. A notary schooled me in signatures that are to be used only when the weather is a certain kind of winter. Sable ink for condolences that move armies. Verdigris for contracts that pretend to be friendships. He made me sign until my wrist learned to be straight, like a sentence that cannot be appealed. He made me sign in gloves to demonstrate that the glove remembers even if the paper is burned. He showed me a drawer of gloves arranged by consequence. The heavy pair at the bottom was stitched with a pattern that looked like frost and felt like law. In a gallery of battles, I learned to walk the pace that says reverence without confessing ignorance. Each painting was a room that wanted to be a tribunal. The docent explained that pausing too long at one slaughter proved weakness, and pausing too briefly proved cruelty, and that both were sins of the inexperienced. He said the elite are graded on how they metabolize other people's catastrophes. He said the correct response is attention without appetite. In a library where paper grew like stalactites, a scribe taught me marginalia. He said the comment on the edge governs the story in the middle. He showed me how to note a victory, so it resembled an apology to those who lost, because those who lost may win again later and will remember you. He handed me a book bound in something that had once known weather, and told me to copy a paragraph in a different hand from mine, so that it would matter more. I did, and the ink smelled like a chapel deciding whether to forgive. A cryptographer instructed me in courtesies embedded in ciphers. He explained that a certain knot in a ribbon means the letter should be opened by someone who dislikes the sender. He explained that 3 dots in the wax are the difference between supplies delivered and supplies discovered. He gave me a code wheel carved from bone and told me to spin it until the numbers behaved like manners. The wheel clicked, and the clicks sounded like distant boots. A dietitian who looked like austerity personified introduced me to breakfast as a briefing. He explained that porridge speaks of supply lines and privilege speaks of fruit. He taught me which seeds should be left on the plate at certain meetings to imply concern for famine on distant worlds I will never visit. He taught me how to swallow a lie with wine and not let it stain the next sentence. He said the body is a chorus line that must hit its marks. He said I would be appraised by the temperature of my tea. A woman from a navigator house visited my lessons unannounced and sat with her hands folded like shutters in a storm. Her third eye stayed veiled, and still it felt like a window left open in winter. She spoke of angles between people like angles between stars. She advised me never to stand exactly opposite anyone of significance because mirrors are dangerous when they are alive. She told me to cultivate diagonals in conversation so that trajectories cannot be plotted. She warned me that debt travels through families like a genetic echo. She left without moving the air. A pair of twins trained me in games no one pretends are games. They set a board with pieces shaped like institutions and invited me to move first. Every opening I chose became a history lesson that cost imaginary lives rendered visibly in white stones. They taught me to sacrifice a bishop to save a bridge, and then to sacrifice a bridge to save a rumor, and then to sacrifice a rumor to save a silence. They sang as they played in a harmony that turned cruel only when I won a small advantage. They congratulated me in a tone that made the word a liability. Flattery in the palace is a leash braided from velvet and arithmetic. A gardener showed me power disguised as repose. He pruned a rose that had been bred to remember a saint and explained how much blood it had cost to make the petals hold that particular red. He told me which plants to place near which benches to encourage alliances and discourage confessions. He dug a line of earth with a care that looked like love and turned out to be cartography. He said hedges are borders, and borders are stories told about fear. He said we water stories here until they root. The poisoner who denies being a poisoner taught me harmlessness. She brewed tea that healed, and tea that hurt, and tea that revealed, and tea that concealed. And she poured each into identical cups so I would learn to smell for intent rather than ingredient. She taught me to watch heat rising from liquid for messages. She taught me to hold a cup with the steadiness of a promise kept long past convenience. She said no one kills the elite. She said the elite season themselves to death with their own indulgences and call the flavor destiny. A master of couriers taught me to read boot scuffs on steps and ink smears on fingers. He said the speed of a message is announced by the dirt it carries. He said the slowest messages are the ones that arrive inside people. He instructed me to send myself carefully when I entered a room. He told me to return myself intact when I left. He laughed at the impossibility and called it his favorite instruction. I learned rings the way some people learn prayers. Gold without etching for old ship money. Iron with lacquer for manufactorum dynasties that believe work is a sacrament. Adamantine set with a sliver of relic for ecclesiarchy patronage that cuts and absolves in the same breath. I learned to kiss a ring without moisture and with sincerity, because moisture offends and insincerity endangers. I learned that 2 rings on the right hand mean generosity and 2 on the left mean the memory of generosity owed. A tutor in voice made me swallow stones the size of truth and hold them against the back of my tongue while reciting the oath of dust so my consonants would strike like hammers. He forced me to speak from a lower place in the chest, where courage lives when it is tired. He said the room must feel your words land before anyone decides what they mean. He said meaning is a negotiation that favors the first inhabitant. Between lessons, I stood in mirrors and practiced the expressions that keep blades sheathed. Pleasant, concerned, invited but not available. A little boredom to imply you already know, a little awe to imply you can still be moved. I erased impatience until it learned to wear patience like a borrowed cloak that fit well enough to fool a doorman. One evening, the inquisitorial rumour returned, and did not show a rosette again. She seated herself beside me at a table that smelled like old victories and newer polish. She took a seed from a small silver bowl and crushed it with 2 fingers that did not look strong enough to crush. She asked me what I smelled, and I said almonds as if the word were a password. She smiled a smile that did not increase the light, and said the other word without saying it. I understood that vocabulary is an execution done politely. She asked me to describe the last benevolence I had witnessed, and I did in sentences that refused to bleed. She nodded and left her shadow behind to finish the interview. I learned to end a conversation without closing it. I learned to leave doors ajar that lead to rooms no one should enter. I learned that apology is a blade ground to an angle that slices pride instead of flesh. I learned to prefer it when the day taught me something expensive, because then I knew what I had bought. At night, I practiced writing without adjectives until the page looked like a verdict. I practiced smiling in a way that suggested I could be trusted to sit near the fire without asking for stories. I practiced the stillness of prey that has learned to read calendars. When the bell called me to a rehearsal dinner for a feast that had not happened yet, I wore the fragrance of rain on metal, and the ring that means I will keep your secret until it benefits you for me to reveal it. I sat where the herald placed me and watched the room practice being inevitable. The toastmaster lifted a glass that caught the light like a warning and nodded to me for a line that would sound spontaneous tomorrow. I stood without scraping the chair. I breathed in the way the surgeon taught me. I measured the silence the herald had rented to me by the heartbeat. I spoke the sentence I had folded all day until it could fit behind my teeth without attracting attention from anything that listens without ears. It landed exactly where it needed to land. The room exhaled the way rooms do when they have agreed not to admit they are impressed. The herald looked down to hide his approval because approval is a farmed commodity. The astropath tilted her head as if the thought had cut cleanly this time. The confessor touched the edge of his cloth as if adding a note to an account that only he could see. The poisoner's tea steamed and revealed nothing but warmth. I sat and tasted cardamom and cautions and the faintest astringency of a future that had decided to notice me. The metronome still ticked somewhere behind the walls. I matched it without thinking and felt my words and bones fall into the same grid. I felt the palace hum adjust half a tone as if considering the new arrangement. I realized my silence had learned to be interesting. I realized the knife in my pocket weighed less than the sentence I had just spoken. I realized the lesson of the day was not how to survive the elite, but how to make surviving look like leadership. I held my cup at the angle that says gratitude and not need. I looked at no one and everyone in the span of a single blink. I let the fragrance in the room shift from cedar to basil to orange blossom as alliances rehearsed their lines. I kept my thumbs hidden. I kept my thoughts folded. I kept breathing to the tempo of a machine that forgives rhythm more readily than it forgives melody. I did not look toward the deeper doors because their mood was not mine to knock. I listened for the bell that means the rehearsal is over and the performance has begun, and I arranged my face to receive it as if it had been my idea. They taught me that luxury is a language and surveillance is its grammar. Breakfast announced this lesson with a plate arranged like a decree. There were eggs that tasted faintly of smoke from a wood no one is allowed to cut anymore. There were slivers of grox cured so thin the light wrote letters through the fat. There was a spoonful of jam the color of a sunset, seen through a stained glass cathedral and priced like a small war. I lifted the spoon and tasted sugar and supply chains, and a monastery somewhere that has forgotten its original sin. The steward stood at my shoulder at a respectful distance and observed the angle at which my wrist accepted privilege. His gaze was kind and unwavering, and calculated to the gram. He made a mark on a slate I was not permitted to read. The mark would decide tomorrow whether my bread came toasted or merely warmed. Even generosity is calibrated here. The room itself practiced discretion, like a sport. Drapes of deep blue softened corners, where microphones are taught to pretend to sleep. Servo skulls drifted in slow circuits that looked like aimless devotion, and were not. They carried incense when priests were near, and a sweet neutrality when priests were not. The cameras were mounted like blessings and angled like admonitions. A polite red light told me they were off when off would comfort me. A quieter light I could not see told someone else they were never off. I learned to sit so that the lenses could translate me into usefulness without needing edits. They gave me a study lined with shelves that did not bow under the weight of approved knowledge. The books smelled of oils and vows, and a history so often rewritten that the pages had become muscular with revisions. A window overlooked a courtyard that had its own weather. Rains were scheduled to glisten victories and wash away embarrassments with equal devotion. On odd days, the sky performed a pale astonishment. On even days, it performed a sober recollection. Statues rotated according to the calendar of triumphs. When a fleet returned, a marble admiral shouldered aside a martyr as politely as stone allows. When a saint's day rose, the admiral stepped back with practiced humility, and the martyr's gaze went a fraction higher. I watched the swaps and learned which way the wind carried favors. Gifts began arriving as if my corridor had remembered a lost artery, a pen of onyx and silver that wrote more obediently than my hand. A blotter cut from a ship's sail that had never known wind, a ring whose inner edge measured my pulse and betrayed it to a chamber I was not allowed to name. Each gift came with a card that said nothing and everything in watermark. I arranged them on my desk by danger rather than beauty. The ring sat at the far left with the grace of a confession. I wore it because not wearing it would be a statement with sharper edges. They sent a chair shaped like a decision, and I tried not to look judged when I sat in it. They sent a carpet woven with a pattern that looked like vines, and was actually a map of a campaign I had once read about in a paragraph too short for the casualties. They sent a decanter of wine with a seal stamped by a house that navigates appetites safely through storms. The wine smelled of old ink and dark cherries and corridors where promises age into treaties. I drank one finger and understood that the vineyard kept its soil with taxes and its workers with hymns. Every sip is a census you file by swallowing. Lunches were briefings disguised as meals. Cheeses marched in from agri-worlds where the sky is a function of irrigation quotas. Olives glistened with the assurance of families who had survived 5 purges and intend to survive 5 more. A silver dish of dates arrived as a footnote that meant a desert planet had paid on time. I bit into one and tasted dust and diplomacy and a sweetness that hides logistics. My valet adjusted the cuff of my coat and asked if I preferred my bread broken or sliced when meeting ecclesiarchy. I asked what the difference announced. He said, broken implies humility and hunger, while sliced implies patience and knives. He advised broken bread on penitential days and sliced bread when bishops perform arithmetic. I told him to prepare both, and he looked pleased to be given a sentence with 2 outcomes. The gardens taught me to walk like an heir to a burden. A pathway of white gravel curved under trees, coaxed from pre-imperial genes that remember forests imperfectly. Their leaves were too glossy to be innocent and too fragrant to be useless. The gardener nodded to me with the professional sorrow of a man who has buried cuttings and politicians. He explained the language of planted proximity. A bench under yew invites confessions convenient to the listener. A bench under laurel invites testimonies rehearsed to sound like revelations. A bench under thorn tells the petitioner this conversation will not be comfortable and therefore must be honest. I sat under laurel when I had to be seen forgiving someone I did not intend to help. I sat under thorn when I wanted rumors to develop a limp. Throne sparrows hopped along the balustrade as if symbolism made them heavy. One perched on a statue's shoulder and pecked at a flake of guilt that had loosened itself from piety. I watched it swallow empire in a speck and fly unevenly toward a tree maintained by men who catalogued leaves. A woman with half her face sealed in gold leaf sat with me once and taught me how the elite rest without relaxing. She said repose is a set of angles. She adjusted my spine and hands until I looked like an invitation written by a lawyer. She asked me to list the names of the flowers that were permitted to bloom within sight of our window. I knew only 2 and mispronounced 1, and she smiled as if a debt had been opened between us. She said I would repay it by never again confusing camellia with camillus. She said the first is a flower, and the second is a child who carries knives for the altar. I thanked her for saving me from a sentence that would have cut wrong. I became fond of small rituals that kept the larger ones from devouring me whole. I arranged my desk each morning to place peril on the left and hope on the right. I polished my own signet with a cloth that smelled of cedar and restraint. I sipped water before wine so my sentences did not arrive drunk. I thanked the servitors in liturgical High Gothic when it would be overheard, and in work cant when it would be noticed by the right hearts. These courtesies are not kindness. They are ballast. I learned the rhythms of the corridor the way a sailor learns a sea he cannot command. The clack of a scribe's shoes announced a memo that wanted to be a chain. The hiss of a pneumatic door announced a favor traveling with disputed urgency. The silence that followed a custodian announced the kind of attention that does not need to speak in order to be obeyed. Sometimes I stood in the doorway of my study and let the corridor pass through me like weather. On feast days, the flowers were organized by victories. Red for blood spent in steady lines, white for the rare, clean outcome, black for the confessions we do not make. On fast days, the flowers were taken away, and the vases remained like mouths that have forgotten the shape of speech. Every object in my rooms recorded me. The pen remembered pressure and hesitation. The carpet remembered traffic and doubt. The chair remembered the angle of my spine when I received bad news. The decanter remembered how often I diluted decision with sentiment. I wiped the pen for ink and never for data. I turned the carpet weakly so that its memory would blur enough to keep me plausible. I leaned back in the chair only when alone, because the chair would tell anyone with access that my bones had learned the shape of surrender. Night arrived on padded feet and set itself down on the ledge like a cat that had eaten well. I lit a candle even though the room lit itself because flame makes a different argument about presence. I wrote sentences that looked like ledgers and ledgers that looked like prayers. I practiced signatures until my wrist ached with the future. I kept my letters short because letters are knives that travel. I kept my diaries long because diaries are knives turned inward, and sometimes that is the only shape that fits. A message appeared on my slate that had not arrived via any method I could trace. It advised me that my pulse at Vespers had been irregular. It suggested a tea and a posture. It appended a blessing in a hand I recognized as belonging to a priest I had never met. I brewed the tea and assumed the posture, and felt the blessing settle like a cloak I was not sure I had earned. I looked out upon the courtyard and watched the gardeners lift a martyr and lower an admiral with the tenderness of men who cannot afford mistakes. I thought about the joy of eating fruit with names after a lifetime of bars with numbers. I thought about the guilt that rises like steam from a pot that never empties. I thought about the taste of copper that has not quite left my mouth since the first summons. At supper, I sat at a small round table in a room that pretends intimacy, and observes everything. A steward in dove grey poured a wine whose vintage corresponded to a campaign not discussed in polite company. A slice of riverfish was placed before me, on a bed of grains that still carried the ghost of rain. The fish flaked obediently and tasted of mountain melt and assurances. The grain tasted of quotas and the name of a planet that will not appear on maps until the right people are dead. I ate slowly and spoke even more slowly because the microphones prefer patient men. Across the room, two cousins from a house that owns machines capable of lifting cities argued in a tone designed to recruit witnesses. Their laughter sounded like glass and filed a report on itself in real time. I folded my napkin precisely and made sure its crease implied neutrality. After supper, my valet presented 2 letters on a tray and a third that was not a letter but an opportunity wearing wax. One letter smelled faintly of basil and regret. The other smelled of orange blossom and ambition. The wax smelled of nothing, and therefore everything. I opened basil first because regret rots if left sealed. It asked for an audience in the garden beneath you. I opened orange blossom second because ambition ferments even behind a seal. It offered a bench under laurel. I touched the wax and felt it yield just enough to say, "Yes, you will." I placed it aside with the reverence one reserves for swords and children. I returned to my study and found a new arrangement on the shelves that I had not requested and could not prove. A book about a siege now sat beside a homily about patience. A collection of maxims had been shifted one hand to the left so that the light fell on a paragraph about debts that do not die. I straightened the rows and let them remain mostly wrong because someone wanted me to notice the lesson, and I did. The night machine under the palace adjusted its tone by a hair, and the hair felt like doctrine. A servo skull floated in through an opening I had believed was decorative and paused as if smelling. Its lenses irised wider and recorded the temperature of my candle and the number of pages I had written, and perhaps the softness of my face when thinking about bread. It chimed once in a key that meant "thank you for your cooperation," and withdrew like a polite pirate. I laughed without sound, and the room took note of the tremor around my eyes. Even laughter is inventory here. I placed the ring on the table and watched the pulse in its narrow glass become a line that did not accuse. I traced the line with a fingertip and promised myself I would drink water until it curved into reassurance. I promised myself I would sleep on linen that felt like mercy purchased at auction. I promised myself I would wake before the bell so the bell would not feel superior. Promises are a currency the palace accepts at poor rates, and still I pay. Dawn is scheduled to arrive with the taste of metal and hope. The courtyards will exchange statues with a whisper of pulleys and prayer. The kitchens will compose a report in butter and salt about a world I have no right to miss. The cameras will blink awake to confirm they never slept. The pen will warm to my hand as if eager to continue our shared crime called authorship. I will choose between broken bread and sliced. I will sit where the steward tells me the air is kind to people who need to be trusted today. I will lift a cup and make the room believe I am not thirsty. I will eat slowly because luxury must be seen obeying itself. I will sign something that tilts a ledger in a city I will never visit, and someone will forgive me by calling it necessary. I will return to the window and measure the garden for changes too small to justify notice and too large to ignore. I will adjust the angle of a chair by a finger's width so that any future photographs prove I was learning. I will thank the servitors in the right language for the wrong reasons and the wrong language for the right reasons. I will practice stillness until it looks like choice. I will keep my thumb hidden and my thoughts folded and my breath respectful of the hum. I will make a ledger out of sweetness and a prayer out of routine, and a shelter out of the exact number of sips. I will be comfortable, and watched, and necessary, and measured, and very nearly content. I will remember to look at the fruit, and name it aloud, so the room records that I can still recognize a gift when it arrives, disguised as accountability. I will remember to look at the cameras and blink once in a way that reads as gratitude. I will remember that roses here are trimmed with shears that never rust and watered with the mathematics of tribute. I will remember that the bread tastes better when someone believes you deserve it. I will remember that deserving is a story we rehearse until it stands up on its own and walks down the hall without tripping any alarms. I will set the pen down with the care one gives to sleeping animals. I will smooth the blotter as if quieting a child. I will fold the napkin into a triangle that says, almost. I will turn the ring twice and wear it again, because it is safer to be known than to be guessed. I will open the window just enough to let in the smell of curated rain. I will stand very still and let the room record what it needs to record. I will taste copper again and call it memory rather than warning. I will continue. The first room that mattered did not announce itself with trumpets. It announced itself with the temperature dropping a polite degree and the smell of parchment deciding to remember blood. I stood behind my patron and to the half-step left, where a conscience would stand if one had been commissioned. The table was a map that had forgotten countries and remembered only obligations. Names carved into the edge winked with the light of 100 candles that burned fat made holy by supply chains. I kept my eyes on the wood grain because wood has no rank and therefore cannot take offense. A herald coughed into a glove, and the cough traveled the room like a courier looking for a signature. I signed with my face by not reacting. Across from me, a Lord Militant smiled in the way a predator smiles when it has already eaten and would like to discuss dessert. His rings were a confession written in metals that glow only under certain suns. He laughed once, and the sound pressed against the glass until it fogged. I spoke my line exactly as rehearsed, and every ear harvested a different truth. That is the work here. Be many messages with one mouth. My words praised frugality and promised abundance and accused no one and everyone in equal measures. The Lord Militant pressed a chit into my hand as he passed later, and the chit smelled of cold starfields and quick decisions. I did not look at it until I was alone with a candle that had been blessed to notice nothing. The coordinates on the chit leaned toward the wrong kind of secrecy. I burned it in a stub of sanctified tallow and learned how fast righteous smoke travels. I told the doorkeeper and no one else because doors remember better than men. He thanked me without changing the shape of his face. His gratitude warmed a coin that had been cold since I arrived. I kept the coin because there are markets where only such currency is accepted. Allies here are written in disappearing ink. An hour of agreement fades to a minute of tolerance and then to a rumor of acquaintance. You must rewrite them often. I learned to keep 3 versions of myself ready: the one I hold, the one I show, the one they believe. When a conversation turned toward knives, I let the 3rd version speak while the first counted doors and the second arranged the cutlery. The ceiling of the council chamber showed constellations that had died before my grandparents learned to pray. They still served to orient us. Dead stars can guide living men when the living refuse to admit how lost they are. A whisper moved around the edges of the room like a draft searching for a confession. I let it pass through me and gave it nothing but the smell of cedar from my sleeves. Cedar means continuity. Continuity means we are still here, and therefore right. An envoy from a navigator house unfolded a fan that was not a fan, and revealed a pattern that meant taxes were about to be a sermon. I nodded once and made a note on the inside of my cheek, where notes do not rust. When the question came, I answered with a number that could be read from 2 angles without either angle losing face. Praise traveled toward me on shoes that never touched dust and stopped at the border of my shoulder because I had not paid for it yet. I kept my head steady and let the approval flow past to the next petitioner. Approval is a river you ford carefully. Some people drown in ankle-deep water here. After the session, I walked the corridor with the pace that says unhurried and reachable without confessing either. 2 aides peeled off from shadow as if they were quotes around a sentence that had decided to defend itself. They offered sympathy wrapped in information, and I accepted the information and left the sympathy on the tray. Sympathy spoils fast. Information keeps if salted with skepticism. I distributed small obligations like crumbs in a garden for birds that carry messages. 1 crumb to a scribe with ink on his knuckle where truth had leaked. 1 crumb to a guard who stands so still the air forgets he is there until the air bleeds. 1 crumb to a laundress who knows which stains admit guilt and which stains admit dinner. Later I found a bouquet arranged to look accidental. Blue flowers for cold logistics, white for clean victories, a single black petal hidden like a missing tooth. I moved the black petal to the rim of the vase, and the man who sent them understood that my answer was not yet, but also not never. On feast days, our clothes were weather. Triumph demanded a climate of gold. Condolence demanded a climate of rain. I wore sable cut like a horizon that refuses to lower itself. I wore a smile that meant I could be forgiven without admitting to a fault that would require paperwork. At the vigil for a saint whose miracles had all been reorganized into policies, we stood in rows that resembled sentences. A bishop read us like a book and skipped the parts he did not enjoy. I bowed to the punctuation and kept my verbs sharp. An assassin is not named in rooms like mine. Even the rumor is allowed only at the edge of the plate like a garnish that no one eats and everyone recognizes. Still, we set the table for them. We position chairs to make a line of travel seem natural. We request certain wines that alter the pace of a heartbeat by a margin only a wrist could measure. We place a mirror so it fractures a reflection at precisely the point where vanity will lean. No one orders death. We arrange it. We excuse it. We call it the arithmetic of mercy. A man vanished between 2 steps and the carpet healed itself. His absence rearranged sentences for an entire week. People said his name more politely after that. Politeness is a wreath you place on the head of consequences. 2 sisters from a house that counts secrets like sailors, count days at sea, invited me to walk in the orchard after 3rd bell. The orchard smells like resolved disputes and damp bark. They spoke in alternation so that their meanings overlapped like scales. One offered a fact that tasted of iron. The other offered a favor that tasted of honey. I declined the honey and accepted the iron, and the trees seemed to approve. Honey sticks to the mouth and gums up future conversations. Iron sharpens into opinions you can carry openly. A hallway of tapestries held battles stitched by hands that had never seen them. The thread shone with the particular luster purchased by victory. The captions were revised yearly, so the dead would continue to agree with the living. I paused the correct interval before the one that showed a siege broken by patience and starvation. A veteran whose medals remembered colder metals stood near and watched my posture. He nodded once. He did not speak. He did not need to. Respect expressed without language counts double. A junior archivist tried to sell me a rumor polished to resemble a relic. I paid him in caution. He left with less than he wanted and more than he understood. I sent the rumor to die quietly in a drawer clearly labeled. Not all deaths are bodies. Some deaths are stories that cease to find listeners. In the afternoon chamber where petitions perform triage on hope, I learned to say no in ways that do not breed rebellion. I learned to say not yet in a tone that makes delay feel like destiny aligning. I learned to say yes, as if it had been their idea, and I was grateful to be permitted to agree. A planetary envoy begged for grain with the desperation of a man who had rehearsed dignity until it cracked. I could not conjure grain. I could conjure a procession. I gave him banners and a day on the calendar, and a charter that renamed hunger into sacrifice. He thanked me with a look that will return to me in sleep. We perform miracles of definition here. Sometimes definitions perform us in return. Evening brought the long table that eats men standing. Crystal sang at the edge of hearing where guilt vibrates. The toastmaster raised a glass cut to resemble a star that forgot how to shine without help. I offered a quip about supply and salvation that bled only a little. Laughter moved across faces like a tax collector. Everyone paid what they could afford. The woman with half her face in gold leaf touched my sleeve and adjusted the angle by a fraction. Angles can be reputations here. A young noble with a smile curated by expensive tutors asked if I preferred mercy or precision. I told him mercy administered precisely. He called it a paradox, and I called it a policy, and we both drank to the same inevitable arithmetic. I excused myself to the gallery where portraits negotiate with dust. A custodian stood like a verdict that never needs to be spoken. I inclined my head the width of a nail. He returned the courtesy with the grace of a mountain moving half a pebble. It meant proceed. It also meant beware. Both are the same advice when you are fortunate. On the balcony, the air carried rumors from lower courts where favors breed loudly. Up here, they breed in silence. I watched the city spread like scripture written by industry. I thought of the man who vanished between steps and the carpet that healed, and I wondered if that was kindness or craft. The bell marked an hour reserved for people who survive by counting. I returned to the antechamber where cushions are apportioned the way provinces are apportioned. I sat on the one that does not creak. Creaks are minutes added to debts. A clerk handed me a folio sealed in wax that smelled faintly of basil. Regret again. Inside lay an apology drafted by a committee and sharpened by a poet who hates committees. I tuned the edges until the words cut exactly the intended throat. The intended throat was fear. Fear bleeds best when punctured with hope. I kept the ink sable. I kept the margins generous to imply magnanimity. I kept a copy for my private ledger because forgetting is a luxury I cannot afford. Night audiences have their own mathematics. Candles lower defenses by pretending to be honest light. Shadows build corridors inside rooms. I received a petitioner whose title outranked his options. He wanted forgiveness at wholesale prices. I offered retail grace with a discount for immediate compliance. He took it and left lighter by 3 ornaments and 2 lies. When the room emptied, the steward brought a cup of broth that tasted of patience and iron. He asked if I would require the late ledger. I said yes, because saying no would tell him I did not intend to work for mercy. He prefers to serve people who work for mercy, even when they fail to find it. The late ledger listed names like beads and debts, like prayers. I moved my pen carefully so no letter would become an oath by accident. I released 2 men from a burden that had grown mold. I tightened a third because his shoulders were built for it, and because he had asked for a favor with the wrong verb. Words have weight, and not all flaws are rated for it. A knock like a fingertip on silk announced someone who eats secrets. She entered without sound and placed a small glass bird on my desk. It looked harmless until the candlelight found its beak. Inside the glass spun a thread of smoke that spelled a name I did not know and a place I did. I breathed once, and the bird forgot the name. We discussed nothing. She left with a nod that meant a hunter had been told where not to hunt. Sometimes survival is pointing the blade away from the throat you will need tomorrow. I returned to the ledger and made a note that said, "Do not turn this into drama. Drama is expensive. Tragedy is cheap. We prefer our catastrophes balanced." At the third hour, I walked the long gallery alone because even rooms need to breathe without witnesses. The portraits watched with the hunger of captured animals. A saint whose miracles had become case law seemed to lean closer. I nodded to her and asked silently for the kind of courage that does not make noise. A draft answered with the smell of old wax and new ink. In the mirror between battles, I measured my fatigue like a general measures distance. Enough to change tactics, not enough to retreat. I reset the set of my mouth to the expression that does not invite confidences, and does not reject them either. I practiced the stillness that makes enemies confess by mistaking you for furniture. I returned to my rooms and found a single camellia on the blotter. Not a Camillus. I said the name aloud to no one, and remembered the debt to the woman in gold leaf. The flower meant a truce offered by someone who had earlier sent thorns. I placed it in water and allowed the truce to live until dawn. The study smelled of cedar and decisions, and the faint copper thread that follows me like a tame warning. I opened the window and let the curated night enter, as if it owned the place. The city answered with engines and prayer, and the sound of men counting what cannot be counted. I closed the ledger without finishing because closing can be wiser than finishing. I laid the pen down as if it could break. I removed the ring and set it where it could see me. It watched the line of my pulse and refused to judge. I sat in the chair that wants to be a throne and leaned forward so it would not get ideas. Tomorrow the table will be another map. Tomorrow the laughter will be another weapon. Tomorrow the rumor will be another bridge I must cross without looking down. I will bring 3 versions of myself and keep the 4th in reserve for fires. I will nod at the correct angels and the correct angles. I will eat slowly and speak slower and let silence do the heavy lifting where blades would slip. I will attend the climate. I will measure the weather in fabric and glances and unsent letters. I will spend the coin the doorkeeper warmed and earn it again by listening for footsteps that change their mind. I will arrange chairs and fates without leaving fingerprints. I will call it service. I will call it policy. I will not call it mercy unless someone can spend the word safely. I will keep the camellia alive until it asks to die. I will remember the man who vanished between steps and make my steps too careful to swallow. I will stand in the half step to the left and be the sentence a patron needs and the silence a room respects. I will hold the door with my back and my mouth and the arithmetic that makes empires appear orderly. I will continue. They permitted me closer with the care of a surgeon, allowing a novice to hold a rib retractor. They said nothing about sight because sight is not the sense that matters where we were going. We began in a corridor that believed itself to be a cloister. Candles burned in bowls of beaten gold and gave off a light too disciplined to flicker. The smoke moved in straight lines as if it obeyed an older geometry. Incense tasted of cedar and ionized air and a sweetness that made the tongue remember vows. The hum under the palace rose one note and spread through my bones like a quiet order. I followed the man whose armor turns corridors into instructions. His stride was not a threat, but a theorem. Footsteps set the time, and the walls kept it. The silence between steps was the margin where we were allowed to exist. We passed a gate that did not open so much as withdraw consent. It left behind a temperature drop that felt polite and absolute. The arch above had been carved from stone that remembers oceans. Spiral fossils hunched in the curve like sleeping saints. Servitors in red shrouds tended braziers that smelled of sanctified oils and hot circuitry. Each brazier was fed with a measured scoop, as if the flame were a ledger that balanced with smoke. A choir began before I realized there were voices. The first impression was pressure against the ribs. Then syllables shaped the pressure into intention. Their song had no melody, and every melody, it felt like being read by something that counts in light. We descended a stair that refused to echo. My breath tried to stumble and learned obedience instead. Ritual marks in silver traced the handrails at intervals that matched a pulse. My fingers did not touch them, and touched them anyway. A sister moved ahead of us like a shadow that had learned discipline. Her presence was the absence of something I could not name without lying. The air around her was honest in a way that hurt. Thoughts curled smaller and went quiet as if bowing. She did not look back because she did not need to. Every step she took made the warp less interested in the rest of us. The walls changed from carved certainty to older certainty. Gold leaf gave way to bare stone, burnished by processions longer than my family line. Reliefs showed angels with helmets and cables for veins. Their wings were flight and fins and radiators and scripture. Between them stretched conduits thick as oaths. They pulsed with a light too slow to be seen and too present to be ignored. We crossed a bridge of latticed adamant that sang under weight like a well-tuned blade. Below lay machinery the size of memory. Vast flywheels revolved with the patience of ages. Pistons rose and fell like cathedrals kneeling and standing in devotion, cables draped like roots seeking deeper permission. Vats glowed with a color that exists only when faith and physics shake hands. Priests in vermilion robes traced glyphs on plates that never cooled. Sparks ascended and arranged themselves into brief constellations and died as if saluting. The breath of the place tasted of metal and my mother's old prayers. The custodian raised one hand, and the world obeyed a new rule. We stopped because stopping was the rule. A procession cut across our path as if beneath a sea of air. Palanquins whose curtains hummed with equations passed like measured promises. On each platform, a figure reclined beneath tubes that nested into skull and sternum and soul. They were shorn to the scalp and anointed at every joint. Their eyes were blind to everything that was not the thing that needs them. Their mouths moved against liturgy and statistics. Accompanying them walked adepts counting on strings of bone beads. Every third bead they breathed together. Every seventh bead they nodded to someone invisible. The sisters paced the flanks, and the air held steady. A bell chimed at a frequency I felt more than heard. Somewhere a lock decided not to fail. The procession turned without turning and vanished into light that was not for me. My guide lowered his hand and the rule changed. We advanced through a door that smelled of thunder about to happen. Pict panels along the passage displayed maps of stars laid out like veins. Lines of force arced like handwriting drafted by a patient god. Here and there were voids shaped like questions no one asks twice. Ritual benches lined the wall for people who sit before entering rooms that redraw them. On each bench lay a cloth embroidered with the names of metals and virtues. I did not sit because my legs preferred honesty. The floor shifted underfoot from stone to articulating plates. Each plate adjusted to weight, then forgot me immediately. Forgetting felt like mercy. A colonnade opened onto a shaft that fell forever. Heat rose with the deliberation of a considered response. Down that throat, voices layered until they became something like weather. I held the rail and counted breaths. The number did not help. We followed the sister across a span that asked for trust and returned it. At the midpoint, a field pressed against my skin, as if inquiring what business I had brought. I presented silence, and the field accepted the document. Beyond the span, a gate of black glass awaited without interest. Symbols along its rim flowed like metal, remembering how to be river. The sister placed her palm upon a sigil that was not there until she believed in it. The glass rippled inward the way sleep does at the first dream. We entered a chamber that had banished ornament in favor of accuracy. Walls breathed with the patient exhale of machinery that never stops and never hurries. There was light that refused to come from anywhere, and therefore came from everywhere. On the far side rose a dais circled in rails and studded with altars that were also consoles. Cables braided like pilgrim hair ran into the core, where ideas go to become infrastructure. Attendants in white stood as still as punctuation. They touched things only when a chime gave them permission to exist with purpose. In the center, there was a presence and not a shape. My eyes tried to make it geometry and failed. My ears tried to make it music and failed. My blood made it a tide and succeeded. I felt counted and not found wanting, and also not found. It moved through me with the politeness of a hand searching for a pulse in the dark. It did not take anything I would miss until later. My guide bowed so slightly the motion may have been a rumor. I imitated and tried not to be a parody of reverence. The sister did not bow because absence has its own etiquette. A tech priest at my shoulder murmured liturgy to a god with screws for teeth. His vox throat made the syllables sound like rain on plating overheard from a century away. He told me to breathe on the count of 4, and to hold on the count of 7, and to release on the count of 8. He said the breath would make the needles not matter. I had not seen needles. I saw them then, and they were not needles, but thin intentions made manifest. The intentions entered my skin with no more drama than a new rule. I did not bleed because the chamber preferred tidy offerings. Heat rose, and memory unscrolled itself to be examined without malice. A voice that was not spoken said measured. Another voice that was only a push behind the ribcage said sufficient. A third voice was just the absence of pain, and it said continue. Someone pressed a wafer to my tongue, and the taste was copper and vanilla and paperwork. Someone marked my palm with oil that smelled like a foundry confessing. Someone affirmed my name at a pitch where names are kept in case they must be returned. I learned the lesson that power is not a flame, but the space around it that chooses who gets warm. We withdrew by the reverse route, but it was not the same route, because I was not the same premise. The bridge sang again, and the key felt friendly. The vats glowed with earned indifference. The conduits pulsed like sermons working their way into hard heads. The choir did not stop, because stopping is not in their vocabulary. I wanted to ask the sister what silence tastes like to her. I did not ask, because questions are alarms here. She looked at me without looking, and I understood that my curiosity was a bead sliding toward a knot. I tucked it away with the other beads. Upward, the stairs reacquired echo permission. The sunlight above had changed angle by the width of a saint's finger. My skin felt reissued. My teeth hummed as if the melody had become resident. The custodian guided me to a balcony that faced an inner court of iron trees. Their leaves were articulated scales that rattled softly when the hidden ventilation sighed. A fountain in the center lifted sheets of water so thin they appeared to be glass deciding again. The water caught the sound from below and turned it into visible tremor. I watched waves lace across a pane that was not a pane and traced the pattern like a penitent following a labyrinth. A confessor approached with a book bound in leather that had never been skin. He asked me what I felt. I said, counted. He nodded because counted is safer than chosen. He asked what I saw. I said brightness that insists on being called hunger. He nodded because hunger is a word priests respect. He asked what I heard. I said names without syllables. He closed the book because sometimes that is the correct amen. He gave me a cloth daubed in holy oils and told me to keep it near the signet. He said it would remind my hand of kindness when my brief requires speed. He said speed is a blade that forgets to bless. He left with the measured gait of a man who knows where forgiveness is kept. My patron joined me and said nothing for the length of a hymn. We watched the iron leaves chat with the air. He told me that proximity is not a privilege, but a pressure vessel. He told me the walls hold because the contents are unbearable if spread thin. He told me to eat salt and drink water and speak sparingly for a day so the body could file what it had been given. He told me that some never return from that descent even when their feet climb all the stairs. He told me that the palace is full of people who look exactly like themselves and are not home. I promised salt and water and measured speech. The promise felt small and crucial, like a pin holding a map in place. We returned to corridors where history expresses itself as upholstery. A page crossed our path holding a cushion with a dagger that appeared ceremonial until you considered what ceremonies require. He knelt with a joy that had not yet learned arithmetic. I kept my gaze level because innocence forgotten is different from innocence destroyed. We passed niches occupied by saints who had volunteered and saints who had been volunteered. Their eyes were paint and stone and expectation. I gave them the angle of my head reserved for veterans and reservoirs. A lift carried us upward with a grace that felt expensive even when the motion was free. Paternoster cages clattered beyond a grill like beads on an impatient rosary. Above us a fresco told a story in which every figure looked like victory even when bleeding. I scanned the borders for a single honest face and found a horse that seemed to know what had actually happened. The lift opened onto a chapel where light fell with rehearsed sincerity. I stood at the threshold because thresholds here are agreements. The sister halted without turning, and the air cooled again by one thought. I left a coin in a basin that liked coins. It liked the weight and the confession. It liked the proof that I still believed in exchange. We stepped into the current of lesser corridors where important errands wear ordinary shoes. A clerk in dove grey passed with a stack of folios that exhaled dust like discreet laughter. A priest murmured a license for a wire to carry more than power. A gardener wheeled a cart of soil that smelled of rain rehearsed to appear unplanned. I recognized the climate of this hallway. It was the weather of continuance. I wanted bread. The need struck with the clarity of a bell one room over. Salt and water and measured speech and bread. I kept walking because the lesson would not be learned in a kitchen. A vault door we were not using exhaled cold certainty just to remind us that it could. Beyond it waited a small empire of possibilities permitted to no one alive at my pay grade. I gave the door the respect of not imagining. A woman in black stepped from an alcove with a tray holding 2 cups. One cup steamed with honesty. The other steamed with comfort. I took honesty because comfort is a story you must write yourself. The brew tasted bitter enough to make truth easier to swallow. The sister accepted comfort and did not drink, and the steam curved away as if embarrassed. We paused at a balcony that overlooked the wider palace. Terraces descended like decisions that could not be rescinded. Choirs braided sound into strength and strength into guidance, and guidance into a light that people call hope, because the alternative would crush the sternum. I thought of the men carried on palanquins, and the lines fed into their veins, and the calculations wrapped around their hearts. I thought of the words measured and sufficient and continue. I pressed the cloth against my signet, and the oil warmed as if remembering skin. A small bell in my ear chimed once and wrote a notification along my wrist. The notification did not use letters. It altered the temperature of my ring by 1 degree, and I understood that someone in a room with no windows had received reassurance about me. The reassurance cost nothing, and therefore cost me later. The custodian inclined his head and allowed the day to resume. We passed a door behind which a machine prayed. Its prayer sounded like patience being sharpened. We passed a gallery in which astronomers argued with silence using chalk and devotion. We passed a refectory where bread broke with the conviction of doctrine. Salt found my tongue and filed itself under instructions. Water followed and assigned itself to all the places that needed cooling. Speech stayed folded in my chest and took notes. In my study, the candle I had left guttered into a shape that resembled a map and then corrected itself. The window framed a courtyard that had rearranged its statues again. A martyr yielded to a victory, and the victory smiled in stone, as if it had not lost 3 times before winning once. The pen lay where I had laid it, and felt heavier by the number of breaths I had counted below. I sat without leaning, and tasted again the air of that chamber which had no ornament and all precision. A thin smear of oil glinted along the seam of my signet, and promised to remind me at the necessary moment. My bones hummed at a frequency slightly lower than fear, and slightly higher than duty. I thought of the word hunger, and I called it light, because naming is a mercy we have learned to perform. I thought of the sister, and the way absence can be a shield built from refusal. I thought of the custodian, and the way presence can be a rule rather than a person. I thought of the choir, and the way voices become structure when intention refuses to fall apart. I thought of the door that did not open, and how it had not rejected me so much as chosen a later day. The slate on my desk woke to itself with the restraint of an obedient animal. A line appeared that said, "You are measured, and you are not finished being measured." I touched the line, and it accepted my silence as acknowledgement. Outside the corridor breathed and moved paperwork as if it were weather. Someone laughed exactly once and stopped before the sound could become a claim. I held the knife by the right end and remembered the feel of the other end. The right end is heavier because it carries restraint. The other end is hungrier because it carries options. I set the knife down next to the cloth and the pen and let them argue without me. The hum under the palace settled into the long note that rings inside the bones of anyone permitted to hear it. I aligned my breath with the count the tech priest had gifted me. 4 and 7 and 8. I watched the light on the wall lay its slow argument across the day. I thought about corridors that ask permission, and gates that withhold it, and bridges that sing when trod by the authorized. I thought about a presence, not a shape, and a tide, not an ocean, and a kindness that is willing to be measured in lumens that do not forgive. I let the taste of copper return, and recede, and return again like a tutor with infinite patience. I placed both hands on the desk and felt the grain accept my weight as a fact and not a petition. I made a list on a blank sheet and did not title it. Salt, water. Measured speech, sign, listen. Do not describe the brightness as anything but required. Do not tell the candle what shapes it had tried to become. Do not imagine the vault door's contents unless imagination has been scheduled and blessed. Do not confuse comfort with relief. Do not confuse honesty with nakedness. Do not confuse hunger with light, even while calling it light. The list looked like a prayer that had discovered its practical side. I folded the page along a crease already present in the paper, and the paper thanked me by remaining folded. Footsteps approached along the corridor at the tempo of a message delivered by someone unwilling to run. The door shivered politely and opened by increments that respected observation. A valet entered with a tray that balanced bread and a directive. He placed the bread to my right and the directive to my left, because traditions prefer symmetry, and we prefer reminders. He withdrew without speaking because my ring still held the later heat. I ate the bread slowly until hunger became comprehension again. I broke the seal on the directive and read the words that meant I would descend again soon. I set the paper under the cloth so the oil would memorize the phrasing. I breathed on 4 and held on 7 and released on 8 and felt the day arrange itself for further use. The fountain in the court below cast thin panes of water that trembled in time with a machine that believes in us more than we deserve. The iron leaves clattered like quiet applause for someone keeping a promise. My hand hovered above the pen and returned to rest, because sometimes the sentence improves by waiting. The hum deepened by the width of a hair, and my teeth agreed to carry it until called upon. I watched the candle regrow its certainty and confess nothing. I adjusted the chair by a finger's width so the photographs would show a man who understood leverage. I arranged my face into the repose of someone who intends to continue. I continued. You do not join anything here. You are absorbed. The body of privilege digests slowly and without visible effort. It begins with favors that present themselves as courtesies. A carriage arrives before the rain decides to fall. A door opens at the instant your hand remembers it forgot its key. A message is delayed just long enough to appear rescued. Someone else pays, and the bill signs your name in invisible ink. I learned to recognize the aftertaste of obligation. It tastes like citrus without sweetness. It lingers behind praise. It waits in the fold of a compliment like a knife folded into velvet. My valet once said that gratitude is a garment cut to measure and lined with hooks. He was right. It hangs well until you try to take it off. The first time I was asked to spend my name, the request wore wool. A note arrived folded into a shape that childhood remembers as harmless. The seal pressed deeper than etiquette requires. The hand that wrote it had practiced kindness, the way fencers practice distance. I read the summons and felt my signature straighten in my bones. A table waited in a small room that smelled of old smoke and newer polish. 3 people sat like punctuation at the end of a sentence that had already decided itself. They did not look at me until looking would be economical. The paper before me named a deficit in a district I had never visited. It named a ship that would not sail unless the deficit became a number with fewer decimals. It named a saint whose day would suffer if the ship failed to bless a harbor with arrival. It named me as the hand that could make the arithmetic confess. I held the pen the way a man holds a blade he once promised only to show. The nib touched the line, and my throat learned a new silence. Ink moved like the last inch of a river going where it must. My name crossed the hinge of the page and did not stutter. The room relaxed by the thickness of a page. A blessing muttered itself into the corners. The ship would sail. The deficit would be renamed. The saint would keep her feast. Somewhere a district recalculated dinner. The pen cooled in my fingers. My hand felt clean and not clean. The bill was not paid. It had only learned my handwriting. After that, the requests learned to knock without knocking. A tray would arrive with 2 cups and a decision simmering between them. Comfort and consequence steamed invisibly. I learned to drink consequence first. Comfort is the second sip, or it is poison. People came to me wrapped in causes that wore faces. A widow whose husband had misread a contract. A captain whose crew had developed a taste for miracles. A choir that needed shoes and a reason to sing hunger into music. I discovered that mercy can be measured in sheets and tonnage and hours of light. I discovered that precision can bruise less than pity when applied early. I discovered that the elite favor tragedies that are tidy enough to memorialize and messy enough to excuse inaction. I tried not to favor anything that would need a statue. Statues are apologies carved into stone. The ledger on my desk began to sound like weather. Rain in the margins, wind in the totals, a dry season where names would not grow into outcomes. I carried my knife in sentences and spent it on timing. One word sooner and a province bleeds. One word later and a friend is devoured by his allies. I learned to be exactly on time in a city that believes in omens. The ring on my finger recorded my pulse and sent it further in than I will ever be permitted to walk. Sometimes it warmed in approval. Sometimes it cooled in advice. Sometimes it kept the time of a machine that does not ask for understanding. A day arrived that smelled of dust and decision. My patron pressed a folder into my hands and did not pretend it was light. He said the case was mine if I wanted consequence. He said consequence is how a name becomes furniture. He said furniture is how rooms remember who sat where when the music stopped. The folder contained a city that could not decide between famine and revolt. It contained requisitions that read like prayers with signatures. It contained an offer to solve everything with a single blade we would not need to hold. I closed the folder and walked the gardens until evening tore the light softly. Thorn for honesty, laurel for performance, yew for confession. I sat with the ghosts of choices. They sat with me the way old dogs sit with men who have fed them and may not feed them tomorrow. I chose a path that would make fewer statues and more grief. I signed the order that turned tribute into bread. I signed the order that turned a parade into work. I signed the order that turned one family's certainty into everyone else's chance. The family understood before the ink dried. They sent wine that smelled like forgiveness and tasted like a ledger closing. I returned the bottles unopened with a note that read, "Not yet." The note was sincere. Sincerity is sometimes worse than lies. At supper I ate the fruit of worlds I would never visit. Each bite gave me an opinion and took a minute from someone else. I counted the minutes allowed to myself until the room learned not to offer seconds. The woman with the gold leaf smiled through one side and said the other side did the same in private. She asked how the name felt spent. I told her it felt like a chair that remembers who sat in it after the sitter has died. She said that is how the palace stores heat. She said she hoped I was comfortable. I told her comfort is a truce we should not sign too early. She laughed the laugh that saves a friendship for later. Assurances arrived wearing uniforms. They stood behind my chair and checked the air for accidents. They watched my glass and my pen and my breath. They did not watch my thoughts because that is not their jurisdiction. My thoughts learned to police themselves. In the gallery, a portrait of a long-dead treasurer tilted by the breadth of a breath. The tilt made him look kinder. The archivists called it humidity. I called it an omen, reminding me that numbers can smile without changing. I requested the portrait be leveled to the old cruelty. The request was granted by a system that prefers straight lines when blood is near. A man I admired asked for a small sin on behalf of a large virtue. He wanted a suspect memory to be retired gently. He wanted a room to forget a conversation that had broken no laws except the ones that grow in jealous minds. I told him forgetting is the one luxury the palace cannot afford. He understood and asked for water. We drank in the silence that makes dissent look like devotion. I regretted nothing, and also regretted. Regret is an instrument tuned daily and never played in public. I tuned it carefully and put it away. Letters arrived that preferred to be burned unread. I read them and burned them and wrote replies I never sent. Unsending is a talent you acquire by surviving your first 5 successes. Failure teaches less here. Success is a teacher with nails. I wore black when I needed to give consolation that would not resemble admission. I wore blue when I needed to give confidence to men who confuse pigment with plan. I wore no ring at all when the message had to be my pulse and not the report of it. The ring sat on the desk and watched me disobey politely. It cooled further and then warmed again when I returned it to its duty. We made a habit of forgiving each other. Habit is cheaper than negotiation. A child of a house that sells sovereignty by the hour approached me in a corridor that smells of dried lilies and old law. He asked if I believed in justice. He meant the kind you can invoice. I answered that I believe in consequence measured carefully. He nodded, as if I had told him a joke he would retail later. He will be dangerous when he learns to laugh alone. A rumor tried to rent my attention with a discount for immediacy. It offered intrigue that would flower into panic if watered. I let it wilt on a sunny sill. Not every garden needs roses. Some gardens need bare earth so footsteps can be heard. I paid 3 small debts at once and discovered that the sum of small debts is a large roof. The rain respected the arithmetic. The men under the roof mistook the weather for grace. I did not correct them. Grace should be allowed to wear disguises on cold days. I signed a denial that saved a life by preventing a glory. The petitioner sent me a statue anyway. It was the size of a regret and the color of consent. I placed it in a window that receives morning light and never speaks in the afternoon. I let it learn shadows. I let it practice humility. I let it watch me write the kinds of letters that take heat from rooms. Once in a while, a stranger's death arrives as a folded hour. The hour sits on your desk and asks to be used. You unfold it and find instructions written in the hand of necessity. It tells you which valves to close. It tells you which doors to open. It tells you which names to move from one column to another. I keep a drawer for the hours that cannot be unfolded without breaking. I keep a key in my pocket for the drawer. I do not forget where the key rests. I do not let anyone else forget what the drawer contains. An inquisitorial shadow paused by my shoulder like a courteous storm. She examined the ledgers with her silence. She examined my hands with her politeness. She examined my face with a patience that had learned to live without sleep. She placed a single seed on the blotter and waited. Almond again. I named it without naming the neighbor. She nodded and asked if I still believed in the arithmetic of mercy. I said yes when applied before appetite. She left a rosette's absence stamped on the air. The paperweight leaned an inch to the right. I shifted it back and kept writing. The city outside wore the color of compliance. Steam rose from factories like exhausted prayers. People moved in lines that resolved into circles by evening. I could smell the oil and the industry from the balcony on clear days. It smelled like a promise loud enough to drown a complaint. I closed the window and opened the ledger. The numbers did not care about air. They cared about balance and heat and the distance between intent and impact. I placed my finger on a line that would starve a lie and feed a truth. I moved it one line down. The truth took longer to chew. The lie stopped knocking early. I slept for an hour on linen that had learned my outline. Dreams arrived and took notes. One wrote my name with the wrong pen. I corrected it, and the pen complained about being used for heavier work than intended. I promised it better sentences tomorrow. The promise felt like paying interest with another loan. Morning entered through the garden with wet knees. The statues turned their faces to the business of being believed. A courier placed a tray beside my pillow with bread and a decision cooling. I ate before reading. Food first, then fate. The letter asked me to bless a purge by calling it hygiene. I blessed a quarantine instead. Less blood, more ledger. Same result after a longer walk. The sender will declare victory in 6 months and send flowers and forget the names of the men who did the lifting. Forgetting will be celebrated at a dinner. The toast will be clever and cruel. I will laugh exactly the correct amount. The knife I chose at the beginning comes back now as options polished to a mirror. Refuse and appear weak. Accept and appear cruel. Delay and appear cunning. I polish the mirror and choose the angle that shows necessity wearing a clean shirt. I gather the debris afterward, so no one cuts their hands pretending the room is tidy by accident. The young learn quickly here. They watch how we bleed and take shorthand. They practice generosity that does not smell of performance. Some succeed and become weather. Some fail and become statues we pretend to understand. I keep a list of names that do not belong on plinths. I add to it in the margin of the late ledger. The margin will outlive the ledger. Margins do that. My patron aged a year in his eyes while his face remained correct. He told me a door would open soon to a higher climate. He warned me that the air thins as the view improves. He offered me a chair that would demand a spine. He offered me a room that would require a throat. He offered me a bill without a number. I accepted the chair and the room and the arithmetic. Numbers arrived later like rain answering a drum. A child crossed the courtyard carrying a loaf bigger than his courage. He tripped and did not fall because a gardener moved a foot and bent a knee and saved a day. I watched from the window and learned again that rescue is a motion, not a speech. I wrote a policy that made bending the knee easier without being noticed. It passed by the width of a word. A captain asked for a clean death for a ship that had served beyond steel and luck. He wanted permission to sink her with singing. He wanted the ocean to close over the song as if it had always intended to. I authorized the choir and the charges and the recording. The record will be used to teach courage to men who will never sail. The sea will not care, and that is why it is good. I visited the vault of gloves and chose a pair stitched in the pattern that resembles frost. Their weight taught my wrists to mean what they say. I wore them to sign a peace that will argue with itself until both sides learn to share a calendar. The photograph shows hands that belong to someone reasonable. The glove remembers the tremor I do not show anyone. At night, the ledger glows like a patient coal. I keep the room dark enough to see where the heat is. I keep the window open enough to hear engines that do not know my name and do not need to. I keep water on the table and salt near the pen and the cloth near the signet. I keep the knife where it can see me. We negotiate terms at bedtime. It promises to be an option. I promise to be a hand and not a habit. The ring ticks once when I lie to myself and is quiet otherwise. It likes quiet the way I like bread that chooses to be honest. Occasionally I allow myself the luxury of daydreams that admit to being daydreams. I imagine a day when I spend my name and it returns with interest instead of receipts. I imagine a ledger that balances by becoming blank. I imagine a chair that forgets every sitter and treats the next as if no one ever failed here. Then I open the door to morning and study the climate I helped to design. It rains promises at the correct hour. It shines consequences where they can be useful. It mists the statues with a grace that keeps pigeons respectful. I walk to my desk and sit with the posture of someone who will be judged by the angle of his elbows. I open the ledger, and the day opens with it. I place my hand on the page and feel the grain of paper accept the shape of choice. I lift the pen and do not hurry. I sign where mercy can travel. I refuse where pride would waste fuel. I delay where patience will grow return. I record losses with the exactness we reserve for vows. I whisper names aloud so the air remembers what the ink cannot carry. I do the work that feeds the light with lives we do not get to keep. I call it service because that word makes the blade look clean. I call it policy because that word makes the cut look straight. I call it necessary because the alternative would be honest and unendurable. I eat slowly when the bell allows it. I speak slower when the room mistakes speed for resolve. I keep the camellia alive a day longer than planned. I keep the truce breathing with water and shade. I keep the chair from believing it is a throne by standing often. I keep the window open just enough for engines to remind me that heat is what we make of motion. I keep my name in my pocket until the next note unfolds and asks to borrow it. I keep paying. I keep collecting. I keep balancing the books of a city that dreams it is a star and a palace that knows it is a furnace. I keep the copper taste where it can teach without scarring. I keep continuing,